All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Maryland State Commission on Criminal Sentencing Policies, Sentencing Guidelines, Quick Q&A, and What's New in MAGS 12.1. My name is Catherine Pembroke. I'm the Administrative and Training Coordinator for the Maryland Sentencing Commission. I'm usually the first point of contact, so if you've called or emailed with a guidelines or MAGS-related question, I'm sure we've spoken at some point. And on behalf of the staff, I just want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to attend today's session. Now, with me today is my colleague Sarah Bowles, and she is going to be helping to answer any questions that you may have throughout the course of the presentation. So let's talk a little bit about the agenda for today's training because the format for this session is going to be slightly different than what we've done in the past. Now, we're going to begin the training by reviewing some commonly asked questions that are most relevant to this practitioner group, that being law clerks and court staff. Now, these questions are going to cover a range of topics. More specifically, we're going to talk about guidelines eligibility, we'll review some material related to guidelines calculation, and then we're going to review what constitutes a guidelines compliant sentence. Now, the second half of the training is going to be a MAGS demonstration, where I'm going to focus on some updates that were recently released with MAGS 12.1 last week. And then I'm just going to walk through a bit of a refresher and show you how to enter various sentencing scenarios in a multiple criminal event, single sentencing event scenario. Now, as I mentioned, I've already compiled some commonly asked questions that are most relevant to you all, but I did build some time into this training to allow for questions from you all in real time. So if we get to a topic that may be relevant to a question that you may have, you can certainly raise your hand, you can unmute yourself, ask your question, or you can certainly submit questions through the chat box throughout the course of the presentation, and Sarah will respond to you. Now, if you do submit a question through the chat box, I do ask that you submit your question to the whole group, just so everyone can kind of benefit from seeing the question as well as the answer. But if you don't feel comfortable doing that, that's fine. I just ask that you message Sarah Bowles directly so that she is able to respond to you. Coming through the chat box, you should also see a PDF of today's presentation that you can download and reference in the future. Okay, so let's begin with a bit of a refresher here. What is the purpose of sentencing guidelines? Now, the guidelines are a mechanism to encourage proportional sentences. The primary goal of the guidelines is to promote consistent, fair, and equitable sentencing practices, whereby offenders who are convicted of similar offenses with similar criminal histories, they're treated and sentenced alike. Now, the Maryland sentencing guidelines were designed to systematically account for the most common variations in offenders and their offenses. The guidelines help to achieve proportional sentencing by identifying and assigning weights to core objective factors for consideration by judges in making sentencing decisions. The guidelines account for the most common, but certainly not all, characteristics of an offender and their crime that are most relevant to the sentencing decision, and they really help to provide a framework to allow judges to consistently assign the same value or score as their colleagues around the state for each of these legitimate legal factors. Now, the Maryland guidelines are scored on two key factors, that being the prior record and the seriousness of the offense. Now, in the Maryland system, an offender score is calculated to account for an offender's prior criminal record. The offender score, it's a summary scale ranging from 0 to 9, which measures an offender's criminal history, accounting for four factors. That being the relationship to the criminal justice system at the time of the instant offense, juvenile delinquency record, prior adult criminal record, and then prior adult parole or probation violations. The second component of the sentencing guidelines is the offense seriousness, which is represented in Maryland by the offense score. Now, for property and drug offenses, the offense ranking is based solely on the seriousness of the offense. But for person offenses, so those typically involving victims like assault, robbery, as well as weapon-related offenses, the offense score is calculated by considering three additional factors. That being victim injury, which can be physical or psychological. 1 point is scored for a non-permanent injury, 2 points scored for a permanent injury or death. Weapon presence, which is the presence of any article or device that reasonably appears capable of causing injury. So 1 point is scored here for a weapon other than a firearm, 2 points for a firearm or an explosive. And then finally, special victim vulnerability. So this refers to cases in which the status of the victim tends to render the actions of the offender more serious. So 1 point is scored if the victim's younger than 11 or older than 64, or if they have a physical or mental disability. Now let's look at a common question regarding guidelines eligibility. Now, do Maryland sentencing guidelines apply to misdemeanors? The answer is yes. So the sentencing guidelines apply to guidelines eligible misdemeanors and felonies that are prosecuted in a circuit court. In recent years, there's been some confusion that the guidelines only apply to felonies that are prosecuted in a circuit court, but again, they also apply to guidelines eligible misdemeanors. So let's take a look at the scope of the sentencing guidelines in greater detail here, because I often get questions about whether a worksheet is or is not required for a given sentencing hearing. Now, the sentencing matters that you see on the left-hand side here, these are guidelines eligible sentencings and would require a guidelines worksheet. So they include circuit court original sentencings, jury trial prayers and appeals from the district court, but only when a pre-sentence investigation is ordered, and cases that are adjudicated via probation before judgments. This also includes the new type of PBJ pursuant to Criminal Procedure Article 6-220, subsection C. In addition to original sentencings, we also collect worksheets for reconsiderations, modifications, and three-judge panel reviews, provided that the sentencing event involves a crime of violence as defined under Criminal Law Article 14-101, and there was an adjustment made to the original active sentence as a result of the recent reconsideration, modification, or review. So guidelines eligible reconsiderations and modifications, they include sentence adjustments imposed pursuant to Maryland Rule 4-345, a Health General 8-507 order, or again, a three-judge panel review. Now, the sentencing matters that you see on the right-hand side here, they're also handled by judges in a circuit court, but they are excluded from guidelines coverage. So they include jury trial prayers and appeals with no PSI, if the offense carries no possibility of incarceration, violations of local laws or municipal ordinances, probation violation hearings, criminal non-support or criminal contempt cases, juvenile court adjudications, and then finally, the guidelines do not apply to district court sentencings. So we often get guidelines eligibility questions regarding two offenses in particular that I want to review. The first is a violation of Baltimore City Code 59-2, and it's an offense that involves discharging of a firearm. Now, even though this particular offense does carry the possibility of incarceration, it's a violation of Baltimore City Code, and therefore it is not a guidelines eligible offense. So even if you see this offense sentenced with other guidelines eligible offenses, it would not be reflected on the guidelines worksheet. Another offense is reckless driving. So you might often see this adjudicated with other motor vehicle related offenses, but this particular offense does not carry the possibility of incarceration, and therefore it would be excluded from the guidelines worksheet. Now, I do want to point out in terms of guidelines eligibility that we have worked with JIS to identify guidelines eligible cases in MDEC jurisdictions, which now all 24 jurisdictions are on board with MDEC. So here's a screenshot of the criminal docket from the Circuit Court for Anne Arundel County. And you can see upcoming cases that are guidelines eligible and would therefore require a guidelines worksheet. They're flagged with this MAGS yes indicator. So I did just want to point out this indicator because just based on feedback I've received from court staff and law clerks, they do often look to this criminal docket just so they can be aware of which upcoming cases will require a guidelines worksheet. So they know after the fact to get in, enter sentence information, and make sure they're submitting worksheets for these guidelines eligible cases. So if you ever have a question, maybe you're not sure if an upcoming case is guidelines eligible, you can look to this criminal docket. You can also always call us. There are some complicated scenarios out there. So always feel free to call us to confirm guidelines eligibility. All right, so here's another question regarding guidelines eligibility. Now, if the Appellate Court of Maryland has remanded a criminal case back to the respective circuit court for a resentencing, is a sentencing guidelines worksheet required in this scenario? So the answer is no. A guidelines worksheet is not required when the Appellate Court of Maryland remands a case back for a resentencing. So as a reminder, in addition to original sentencings, we collect worksheets for reconsiderations, modifications, and three-judge panel reviews when there is an adjustment made to the original active sentence. An appellate court remanding a case back to the respective circuit court for a resentencing, it's a different type of sentencing matter than that of a reconsideration, modification, or three-judge panel review. So this is why a guidelines worksheet would not be required in this scenario. But I do want to note that if the appellate court was remanding a case back for a new trial, then we would require a worksheet for the new trial. Okay, now let's move on to talking about guidelines compliance. And here's a common question that I receive. Now, why is MAGS, the Maryland Automated Guidelines System, flagging the overall sentence as a departure from the guidelines? So maybe you entered all the sentence information, you're expecting there to be a departure, and you're not sure why MAGS is saying there's no departure. And the answer, it could be that the overall sentence is not a guidelines compliant sentence. So let's review what constitutes a guidelines compliant sentence here, because this information is going to be important to keep in mind when you're entering sentence information, and maybe have a question about whether a sentence is guidelines compliant when it comes to MAGs. Now, a sentence is deemed compliant with the guidelines if the guidelines applicable sentence, which is defined as the sum of incarceration, credited time, and home detention time, if it falls within the applicable guidelines range. So generally, suspended time is not considered when determining if a sentence is compliant. There's one exception involving corrections options program, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But again, generally, it's the sum of incarceration, credited time, and home detention time that's determining guidelines compliance. Now, I do want to note that compliance is calculated by comparing the overall sentence across all adjudications in a given sentencing event to the overall guidelines range for that sentencing event. So for example, it's possible that the sentence could exceed the guidelines limit for one offense, fall below the lower guidelines limit for a second offense, but the overall sentence when adding together the sentence for both counts, it falls within the overall guidelines range for that sentencing event. Now, there are a few qualifiers to consider regarding guidelines compliance. The first is that sentences adjudicated pursuant to an MSCCSP binding plea agreement are deemed guidelines compliant. Now, binding pleas are three-party agreements in which the defense and the state present to the court on the record an agreement that incorporates a specific sentence. Now, effective April 1 of 2021, the Commission narrowed the definition of what constitutes a guidelines compliant plea and adopted language to specify that an MSCCSP binding plea agreement means an agreement to a specific amount of active time, if any, not merely a sentence cap or range. Now, the court has the discretion to accept or reject the plea, but the agreement is binding on the court under Maryland Rule 4-243, subsection C, if the court accepts that plea. So let's take that information and apply it to some hypothetical sentencing scenarios here. Now, let's say the guidelines for a sentencing event are 2 years to 8 years. The state and the defense present to the court a plea agreement to a sentence range anywhere from probation to 2 years. The court accepts this agreement and sentences the defendant to 3 years, suspend all but 1 year. Is this an MSCCSP binding plea agreement? The answer is no. This would not constitute an MSCCSP binding plea. So as a reminder, an MSCCSP binding plea, it must involve an agreement to a specific amount of active time, if any, so not merely a sentence range or cap. And in this scenario, the court accepted a plea agreement to a sentence range anywhere from probation to 2 years. This is why it would not constitute an MSCCSP binding plea. So let's look at sentencing scenario number 2. Let's say the guidelines for the sentencing event are 1 year to 6 years. The state and the defense present to the court a plea agreement to 5 years, all suspended, with credit for 62 days. The court accepts this agreement and sentences the defendant to 5 years, all suspended, with credit for 62 days. Is this an MSCCSP binding plea agreement? So the answer in this scenario is yes. So in this scenario, there was an agreement to a specific amount of active time, that being 0, or in other words, no post-sentence incarceration. Therefore, this would constitute an MSCCSP binding plea agreement. Now, an additional qualifier regarding guidelines compliance to consider is the role of corrections options. Now, sentences to corrections options programs, we're going to look at the entire list on the next slide here, but those involve drug courts, residential substance abuse treatment, home detention. Sentences to those programs are deemed compliant provided that the initial sentence plus any suspended sentence falls within or above the applicable guidelines range, and the case does not include a crime of violence, child sex abuse, or escape. So this is the one exception I mentioned earlier in which suspended time is considered for determining a guidelines compliant sentence. Now, corrections options, they allow judges to utilize a broader range of alternatives to incarceration while still remaining compliant with the sentencing guidelines. So corrections options include home detention, inpatient residential treatment, inpatient drug or alcohol counseling under Health General 8-505 or 8-507 order, drug court, participation in any problem-solving court, a sentence with required substance abuse treatment for the possession of CDS, work release, or weekend or other discontinuous incarceration. So here's a question regarding guidelines compliance and the use of corrections options programs. Now, do I need to mark a corrections option program if the defendant successfully completed the program prior to sentencing in their respective case? So the answer is yes. Pre-sentence participation in drug court or any other problem-solving court, it should be reflected in MAGS. We want to make sure that you are correctly marking those, that participation in a corrections option program, since, as we know, it does factor into guidelines compliance. So let's take a look at another sentencing scenario here. Let's say the overall guidelines range for the sentencing event is 1 year to 3 years. The defendant was sentenced to a 6-year total sentence, all of which is suspended. Now, the defendant was also sentenced to drug court, a corrections option program, as defined under commission criteria. Now, which of the following best describes the sentence imposed? Is this a departure below the guidelines, a departure above the guidelines, or a guidelines compliant sentence? The answer is this is a guidelines compliant sentence. So, as previously noted, sentences to corrections option programs, they're compliant provided that the total sentence falls within or above the applicable guidelines range, and the case doesn't involve crime of violence, child sex abuse, or escape. So in this case, there was a 6-year total sentence. The defendant was also sentenced to drug court. So that 6-year total sentence falls within or above the overall guidelines range of 1 year to 3 years. And given the use of drug court here, this is why it would constitute a guidelines compliant sentence. And then finally, the last rule regarding the calculation of guidelines compliance is that sentences in which the offender received credit for time served with no post-sentence incarceration time, and if the amount of credited time exceeds the guidelines range, it's going to be deemed guidelines compliant. So for example, if the guidelines range is probation to 3 months, the sentence is 6 months fully suspended with credit for 100 days, the sentence is still guidelines compliant even though the credited time exceeds the upper guidelines limit. And MAGS is already programmed to account for this scenario. Okay, so that wraps up the first part of the presentation where we talk about the commonly asked questions and guidelines compliance. Are there any questions regarding those topics before I move into the MAGS demonstration? I'm going to give you all an opportunity to ask any questions you may have about that. Let me just quickly. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so just give me a moment here and I'm going to pull up MAGS.
Catherine, real quickly,
Yes.
we had a question in the chat as to the report that produces the MAGS eligibility flag. Is that a report produced within MDEC, and what would it be called?
I know I believe it's called the facility court docket, I want to say, and it should be a report that you can run in MDEC.
Okay.
I would maybe ask like the clerk's office or maybe like the court administrator in your jurisdiction. I'm not sure if it differs jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but I do know it is a report that can be run in MDEC. Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, give me 1 second to pull up MAGS here. Or it could be run in Odyssey, which I think they're one and the same. But someone can feel free to correct me on that. Okay. All right, so you should be seeing my MAGS login screen now. And let me just go ahead and quickly log in here. Now, I'm sure many of you at this point are at least somewhat familiar with MAGS, so I'm not going to focus on every single aspect of MAGS for this demonstration. I'm really just going to kind of highlight some recent updates and give a bit of a refresher for some of the more complicated components, that being like entering various sentencing scenarios, um, especially following our MAGS 12.0 deployment from last year. Just some questions I've gotten about entering sentence in the new sentence format and all that. We will review that. Okay, so after logging in, you're going to be brought to our MAGS home screen here, and it's from the home screen where users can obviously create a new worksheet or view, edit, or delete an existing one. Now, you all are going to be searching the system for previously initiated worksheets that were initiated by the state or parole and probation, where you then proceed with entering sentence information. Now, before we do that, I actually want to point out one feature that was deployed with MAGS 12.0 last year, which is this reconsideration modification or three-judge review for COV sentences feature. Now, as we talked about earlier, in addition for original sentencings, we also collect worksheets for reconsiderations, modifications, and reviews if there was an adjustment made to the original active sentence as a result of that recent reconsideration, modification, or review. Now, ideally and generally, the state's attorney should be initiating any worksheets for an upcoming reconsideration, modification, or review. Just like in original sentencing, you would then proceed with entering the amended sentence information and then submitting the worksheet. Now, that said, again, I want to show you how this feature works, just because I know a lot of you probably get our monthly MAGS reports circulated or forwarded to you all. Maybe you've seen one of the cases from your sentencing judge that was flagged as a modification for a crime of violence, and it's requiring a worksheet. So maybe you've like nudged the state's attorney to initiate the worksheet for that particular case, but maybe they're on leave or you're having trouble getting an answer from them in a timely manner. So I do want to note that you all do have the ability to basically initiate worksheets for reconsiderations and modifications. Not as scary as it sounds. You're basically copying how the guidelines were calculated for the original sentencing, because by guidelines rule, the guidelines should be the same for an upcoming reconsideration, modification, or review as they were for the original sentencing. So let me show you how this feature works. Let's say on this MAGS report, you saw one of your cases that is requiring a worksheet for a modification to a crime of violence. So to search for the worksheet that was originally sentenced for the original sentencing, submitted for the original sentencing event, you would simply check this little box here next to the reconsideration, modification, or review. And you can see once I do that, the majority of the search features are grayed out and disabled. So you would solely search by case number here. So I'm going to go ahead and enter my case number and click search. So you can see once I do that, I get a return for a John Smith with that same case number. I can see it was sentenced back in November of 2023. And if I look to the right-hand side, there's a little check mark under submitted. So that's how I know that it was submitted. Now, these two icons on the left-hand side has judges and their designees. You all have read-only access to submitted worksheets. So this little download icon, that's how you can view any worksheet that's been submitted. So again, if you ever have a question about whether a worksheet was in fact successfully submitted, you can always click this include submitted worksheets box here, search, and then you should see this little download icon. Now, this copy icon that you see on the left-hand side, this gives you the ability to copy a worksheet that was submitted for an original sentencing here. So if I go ahead and click this copy feature, I just confirm that yes, I want to copy the worksheet. You can see once I do that, a lot of this information will pre-populate based on the information that was submitted on the original worksheet. So you would then proceed with just entering the worksheet preparer name. Let's say it's law clerk here. And then some of the fields are editable, for example, PSI status, representation. It's possible those have changed from the original sentencing, so you can make modifications there and then click Save this page. So that's really all you have to do if you're copying an original worksheet for an upcoming reconsideration modification. If I just quickly scroll through these next few tabs here that are generally completed by state's attorneys in parole and probation, again, you can see they're disabled. They pre-populate based on information that was submitted on the original worksheet. So you would then proceed with just entering victim information like you normally do for an original sentencing, and then proceed with entering the modified sentence information following a reconsideration, modification, or review. Now, I will note that if you do utilize that feature and search the system for a case number and you don't get a result, it's possible that we didn't have a worksheet submitted for the original sentencing event. So in that case, you're kind of out of luck. And then it would really be on the state's attorney to initiate a worksheet from scratch for that recent reconsideration, modification, or review. So then again, you could proceed with entering the modified sentence information. So it's a pretty quick and easy feature to utilize, which again is why I wanted to point it out to you, but ideally the state's attorney should be taking care of this for you. Okay, so let's say I am going to search the system now for an original sentencing here. I'm sure you're all familiar with the various ways you can search. I already went ahead and created a sample test case, so I'm going to filter by Kent County, and then I'm going to enter my defendant, which is Edward Smith here. Okay, so you can see once I do that, I get a return for an Edward Smith, and I can see there are two different case numbers here, 1122 and the other one ending in 4475. Now, looking on the left-hand side here, I want to talk about the worksheet ID field. Now, when there are multiple cases that are being sentenced in front of the same judge on the same day, they constitute one sentencing event, meaning that one set of sentencing guidelines should be initiated in MAGS. Meaning, again, that the state's attorney clicks this add new button one time, and then when they get to the list of offenses tab, that's where they enter all of the unique case information. Now, if a multiple criminal event, single sentencing event scenario is initiated properly, if you just generally search by either SID number or defendant name, you should see both of those case numbers, or however many unique case numbers they are, you should see them linked and share one worksheet ID number. That's how you can ensure that a multiple criminal event, single sentencing event scenario was initiated properly. Now, let's say you searched, you do see both of these case numbers appear, but they have two separate worksheet ID numbers. There's two issues that you are going to run into. I'm sure many of you have already run into this issue. But the first main issue is that when worksheets for multiple criminal events, single sentencing event scenarios are initiated separately, the first and biggest issue is that the judge is not presented with a proper overall guidelines range in that scenario. The second issue comes into play when you all go to try to submit these worksheets. Now, if these did have separate worksheet IDs, you'd be able to enter sentence information for those cases, no problem. You'd even be able to submit the first worksheet, no problem. When you went to submit the second worksheet, you would then get a duplicate error message. It would say, wait a second, there's already been a worksheet submitted that contains the same SID number, date of birth, and date of sentence as a worksheet that's already been submitted. And that's MAGS's way of catching multiple criminal event, single sentencing event scenarios and saying, wait a second, these need to be combined. And then, as I'm sure you all know, you reach out to us, we combine those worksheets for you, and then email you back a revised PDF. So again, the worksheet ID field is an important field to pay attention to just so you can kind of get ahead of any of those issues. Now, let's say you got this return, you see two different worksheet IDs. I would then encourage, before you even start entering sentence information, to reach out to the state's attorney and ask them to combine the worksheets for you prior to entering sentence information and trying to submit the worksheets. One, it's less work for you. And then two, it's also a good reminder for state's attorneys to know that that is how they should be initiating multiple criminal events, single sentencing event scenarios. Now, the good news is I'm not going to walk you through step by step how this new feature works, but we did deploy a new feature and update with MAGS 12.1 last week. That's essentially going to prompt state's attorneys in parole and probation to properly initiate multiple criminal events, single sentencing event scenarios. So in this type of scenario, let's say they initiated the worksheet for the 1122 case, and then they went and clicked add new and created a separate worksheet for 4475. Now, since those two cases involve the same defendant, they would then actually get an alert that would say this looks like a duplicate worksheet. Basically, is this 4475 case being sentenced with 1122? If so, they need to be combined. And then there's a little button that they can click, which would then prompt them to enter all of the unique case information under the list of offenses tab. So I know that was a bit of a long-winded way of explaining what this new feature is, but I did want to let you all know that we did implement this new feature because it should hopefully eliminate a lot of this duplicate worksheet work and errors that you all run into. So we're really excited about this new feature, and we hope it's going to be very helpful for you all. Okay, so now that I've discussed that, let's go ahead and proceed with just entering some basic sentence information for this scenario here. So let me go ahead and click my little edit icon, which brings me to offender information. Now, whether you're editing a previously initiated worksheet or adding a brand new worksheet, you're always brought to the offender information tab first. So you can see MAGS splits up various sections of the worksheets into various tabs here. Now, really, offender information, offender score, and list of offenses, and then majority of victim information, that should be completed by the state's attorney or parole and probation prior to sentencing. And then post-sentencing, you all go in, enter some of the remaining victim information, individual sentence information, overall sentence, alternatives to incarceration, and then departure and submit. So let's quickly kind of just walk through the scenario tab by tab here. So beginning with victim information. Now you can see a lot of these fields, and if I were to click on this little information icon here, you'll see them scattered through MAGS. If you click on them, it gives you a more detailed explanation of what we're trying to capture there. So the majority of these fields should be completed by the state prior to sentencing, but that said, some of them cannot be completed until after sentencing. So for example, whether the victim was present at sentencing, if they gave a written or oral victim impact statement, you could make those selections there and then click Save this page. Okay, so moving forward to the sentence information tab. So this is where we really start entering the individual sentence information for each individual offense. Now, one thing that I do want to note, because I do get a lot of questions about this, the sentence tab basically mirrors the list of offenses tab. So let me jump quickly back to the list of offenses tab here. Now, one thing that we'll talk about, and I'm going to do this kind of towards the end of the presentation, merged or null prost offenses should be removed from the guidelines worksheet. Ideally, the state's attorney should be deleting these from the worksheet for you, even prior to getting in and entering sentence information. But if you, again, that doesn't always happen in a timely manner, and it's a really quick step that you all can take on your own. So to delete a merged or null prost offense, you would want to click on the list of offenses tab and then click on the little trash can icon next to whatever offense was merged or null prost. So I do want to note that that has to be done from the list of offenses tab. Um, a lot of people get confused because they look identical and they try to do that from the sentence tab. And this trash can icon on the sentence tab, it's just going to delete the sentence information, not the entire offense. So just kind of pay attention to the tab headers whenever you're trying to complete those steps. Okay, so let's proceed with entering some individual sentence information for the murder first degree here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on my edit icon, which brings me to my offense sentence for murder. Now, I do want to note that statutorily, a life sentence must be imposed for first-degree murder. So it can be partially suspended, but at a minimum, it has to be imposed. So that is why you will see MAGS flagging this life sentence box whenever you have a sentencing event that involves first-degree murder. It's automatically going to flag that for you. Now, jumping down to the total sentence in years here, you'll see that it populates as 100 years. Now, for guidelines compliance and calculation purposes, we had to assign some sort of numeric value to life in MAGS. So the equivalent is 100 years, which is why whenever you check this little life box, you'll see the total sentence populate as 100 years. Then you would proceed with entering the suspend all but amount, which includes any active jail, prison, credit, or home detention, credit for time served, and then home detention. So let's go ahead and let's say I want to enter a sentence of life, suspend all but 85 years with credit for 182 days. So let me go ahead and start entering that information. I already have life flags, so I'm going to proceed with entering suspend all but 85 and then 182 for the credit. Now, I do want to note that we also have this days calculator. So let me click on this. So sometimes I know on hearing sheets, credit for time served can be reflected with words such as, sentence date to commence as of, and it gives you a date that precedes the actual sentence date. That generally means that there's credit calculated from that earlier date to the sentence date. So sometimes you may not have the credit for time served already calculated, but what you can do, you can simply plug in that sentence start date as well as the end date, which is the sentence date, and then you can click calculate days and just save it directly to the MAGS system. So if that's helpful, please utilize that tool. Okay, so I have life, suspend all but 85, credit for 182 with 0 home detention. So you can see once I enter those first 4 fields, MAGS automatically calculates the guidelines applicable sentence for me. Again, we talked earlier, the guidelines applicable sentence is the sum of incarceration, credited time, and home detention time. Then moving on to the right-hand side here, you're always going to be prompted to answer whether the sentence for this offense is consecutive to another count in the sentencing event. If it is consecutive, let me just go ahead and quickly check yes here. You'll get this little alert. It's just a reminder that says if one count is to be served consecutively to another, yes must be selected for both counts in order for the sentences to be summed to obtain the total sentence length. So again, let's say you're referring to a hearing sheet. Maybe it says, you get down to a count 3 and it's saying that the sentence is to run consecutive to count 1. In that scenario, you would want to make sure you are flagging both count 1 and count 3 as consecutive, meaning you would want to answer yes to this question for count 1 and count 3. Now, if your sentences are all running concurrently to one another, or if you just have one offense in the sentencing event, you can mark no. So for this training, I'm just going to go ahead and assume that all of these sentences are concurrent, so I'm going to answer no in response to this question. So then you would answer whether a probation before judgment was granted for the offense. And then jumping down, you would select whether subsequent offender status was proven and if there was any restitution. So I'm going to click save this page and close. Once I successfully save sentence information, there's going to be a little check mark next to the entered column as well. Okay, so we have the murder first degree down. Let's move on to burglary first degree here. Now, the murder first degree, that was partially suspended sentence. Now let's enter a suspend all but credit for time served sentence. So let's say for this burglary first degree, I want to enter a 10-year suspend all but 182 days with credit for 182 days. So I'm going to begin by entering the total sentence as 10 years. I'm suspending all but the 182 days because again, that suspend all but field includes jail, prison, credit, or home detention. So I want to reflect 10, suspend all but 182, and then further clarifying that that 182 days is credit. With 0 home detention, these are all concurrent, no PBJ, no subsequent offender, or restitution for this offense. So I'm going to click save this page and close. All right, moving right along to the distribution of heroin. So let's say I want this to be a 5-year fully suspended sentence. Let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to begin by entering 5 years for the total sentence. Now, I will say fully suspended sentences in this new sentence format, it can be a little confusing, a bit of a learning curve because it does sound kind of awkward. But when you are entering a fully suspended sentence, you essentially want to enter the total sentence, which in this case is 5 years, and you're suspending all of that but 0. So if you're entering a fully suspended sentence, you want to make sure you're plugging in 0 in the suspend all but field, with 0 credit for time served and 0 home detention. Now, really quick regarding credit for time served, I do want to note that if you have offenses and the sentences for all of those offenses are running concurrent, you can reflect the credit for time served for all of those offenses. However, if you have sentences that are all running consecutively, or maybe a mixture with some sentences running consecutively, some running concurrent, in that scenario, it would probably be best just to enter the credit for time served for one offense. Otherwise, if you were to enter it for all offenses, MAGS is going to add that amount of credit for time served up across all of the offenses that are flagged as running consecutively. So in this hypothetical scenario, I'm kind of showing you how different sentencing scenarios should be entered into MAGS. So I'm not entering the credit for time served for all of them, but again, I do want to note that you can enter it if the sentences are running concurrently. Just something to keep in mind. Okay, so 5, suspend all but 0. Again, these are all running concurrently with no PBJ and no restitution. Okay. Okay, so moving on to my felony theft here, 1,500 less than 25,000. So here I'm going to show you a couple different sentencing scenarios. So let's start by entering basically a 1-year flat sentence. So I'm going to enter 1 year as the total sentence, and you're suspending all but that 1 year, right? Because there is still going to be 1 year that in this case is going to be served on home detention. So let's say you enter the 1 year, suspend all but 1 year. Now, when you have credit for time served in a period of home detention, this is going to be the only type of scenario that will require you to do a little bit of math in MAGS, because you have to get the sum of credit for time served and home detention to equal the suspend all but field. Since we capture credit for time served in days, the easiest way to do that is to convert home detention also into days, and then you subtract the credit from that amount of home detention. So in this scenario here, I have the 1 year to be served on home detention with credit for 182 days. So I basically convert that 1 year of home detention into 365 days. I am then subtracting the 182 from 365, which leaves me with 183 days, right? So that way I know the sum of credit and home detention, it's going to equal that 1 year here. Okay, and then jumping down, let me just go ahead and answer these. So let's say there was restitution here and it was $1,500. If maybe you know restitution was ordered, sometimes restitution hearings happen at a later date. So if you don't know the amount, you can always just check that box that says unknown amount here. Okay, so then I would click save this page and that successfully saves. So let me go back. I'm going to delete this information real quick. And I want to show you 2 other quick scenarios here. Okay, so let's say for this felony theft, let's say the judge stated on the record that the sentence for this offense is generally suspended. Now, there's been a little bit of confusion since we added this generally suspended flag last year, but really you only want to check this box if the judge specifically states on the record that the sentence is to be generally suspended. If that's the case, you check this box, you can see that all of the sentencing fields pre-populate as zeros, and you would just simply proceed with entering the rest of the information here. Now, let's say maybe a probation before judgment was granted for this felony theft, but the sentence wasn't necessarily generally suspended. However, with the probation before judgment, there wasn't really any other formal sentence that was imposed. But since these are mandatory fields, you're going to have to enter something in for them, that being zeros. So if there's a probation before judgment, you would proceed with entering all zeros and then marking no, and then you would want to go and check yes for the probation before judgment here, and then click save. Whoops, forgot to check the restitution. Now, one fix that we deployed recently with MAGS 12.1 is when you flag that there was a probation before judgment granted for the offense and you enter zeros for all of the sentence fields, you're now going to be able to save this particular sentence with no issue, no alert message. Now, when we deployed 12.0 last year, up until this recent deployment of 12.1, when you were entering sentences that were comprised of all zeros and then flagging a probation before a judgment, you were getting this little alert message that I'm going to show you here. To move my toolbar down. And it says this, it says you've entered a total sentence of 0 for this offense. If the offense was merged or null prost at sentencing, please delete the offense from the list of offenses tab, as again, merged and null prost offenses should be removed from the guidelines worksheet. And it was causing confusion when people were getting this alert message because they thought that it meant you couldn't save a sentence with a PBJ and all zeros. That wasn't true. If you were just to click save this page, you would have been able to save it no problem. We added that alert message back when we deployed MAGS 12.0 just to kind of alert users whenever they enter a sentence value that's just comprised of 0. Because we were seeing worksheets submitted with merged or null prost offenses, and since those types of offenses don't have individual sentences, people were just entering zeros for them in order to submit the worksheet. So that alert message just appears as a reminder. Now, if you were to enter all zeros and select no for a PBJ, but if you enter all zeros and select yes, you can see I now save it no problem. So hopefully that helps eliminate some confusion. So I did want to mention that that was a fix that we made with this recent deployment as well. Okay. So I think we've walked through a bunch of different scenarios at this point in time. One last thing that I want to show you all before we move forward, if you click the information icon next to suspend all but, and then if you click here in this last sentence, it brings you to this PDF that details how to enter various sentencing scenarios. And if you scroll down, we've tried to think of every single scenario that you could come across and how you should enter it into MAGS. So if you ever have a question, this could be a really useful resource for you to refer to. And always just feel free to contact us too if you have a question here. Okay, let me pull this back up and save it. Okay, so let's proceed with entering some additional information. So once all the individual sentence information is entered, I move forward to GLS overall sentence. So you can see that MAGS calculates the total sentence overall across all of the offenses on the left-hand side here. So I can see total sentence is life, suspend all but 85 years, credit for 182 days. So looking to this overall guidelines applicable sentence of 85 years, I can see that it looks like it's a below departure from the overall guidelines range of life plus 0.5 years to life plus 5 years. So I'm going to go ahead and proceed with entering some additional sentence related information. I'm going to go ahead and select other plea agreement. Now, regarding disposition type, if you ever have a question, again, click on this information icon because we give definitions for what constitutes the various disposition types. And again, you can call us if you have questions here. And sometimes reaching out to the state's attorney or the sentencing judge, they will also be able to provide more information about the terms of the plea agreement if you have questions. Because we do want to make sure the disposition types are being reflected properly, since as we know, binding plea agreements do factor into guidelines compliance. Now, if you have a case involving a crime of violence, you're going to be prompted to select whether it's the original sentencing event or a modification. If this were a modification, you would then just be prompted to select the type of modification. So whether it was pursuant to Maryland Rule 4-345, which is kind of a typical reconsideration, Health General 8-507 order, or a 3-judge panel review. So let me go ahead. I'm just going to change this back to original sentencing. Going to enter 5 years of probation here. This 50% of sentence announced, this becomes a mandatory field when you have a crime of violence as defined under Correctional Services 7-101. So that's all the crimes of violence under Criminal Law 14-101 plus burglary first, second degree. It's basically asking you to indicate whether there was an announcement made regarding the mandatory serving or 50% of a sentence for violent offenses. So statutorily, when a sentence of confinement that is to be served is imposed for a violent crime under Correctional Services 7-101, the judge should be stating the minimum time the defendant must serve before becoming eligible for parole. So if that announcement wasn't made, you can go ahead and mark no. If it was, you can go ahead and mark yes. Victim court costs imposed, whether a no contact order was granted, and then whether the judge made a written request for parole notification. And finally, jumping down to additional information, this is where you can really add any additional information to either clarify sentence information, perhaps conditions of probation, really whatever the judge would want reflected on the worksheet. So saving this page and close. Now, I'm gonna skip over the alternatives to incarceration tab for one moment here, and I'm gonna jump to the departure and submit tab. Now, let's just say really quick, MAGS automatically flags whether the sentence is a departure based on the information that you enter. So here, I already mentioned that the 85-year guidelines applicable sentence is falling below that overall guidelines range, so MAGS is flagging this as a departure. Now, let's say I skipped over alternatives to incarceration and went ahead and just selected a departure code here really quick. And then I just want to go ahead and submit this worksheet here. So you can see once I do that, I get this message saying submission failed. One of the required fields is missing from the alternatives to incarceration screen. Now, this alert message has always existed, but with MAGS 12.1, this alert message is now going to specify which screen is missing required information. I think this is also going to be a really helpful feature because a lot of times you all would get this alert message and you'd call and you would say, I am 100% sure I had all of the required fields completed. I have no idea where it's telling me it's missing. And then we kind of have to go through a search together over the phone. So hopefully this screen will now direct you directly to the screen missing information. And I think that'll be really helpful for you all. So now I quickly know I can just jump back to alternatives to incarceration and fill in these required fields here. Now I'm going to go ahead and mark no to this first question asking if the offender was sentenced to a corrections option program, and no to the other alternatives to incarceration for now. And then we're going to go back and make some quick changes in a moment here, because I want to show you how compliance changes based on different selections that I make. Okay, so again, this is still a below departure for the guidelines, so you're then prompted to select departure codes. Always check with the judge to confirm which departure codes should be reflected here. You can select from the most common reasons for departure, which will be changing effective July 1, 2025. So we'll be sending out some guidance and correspondence regarding that, but just know that there are some changes coming regarding the reasons for departure, the common reasons rather. Now, if none of the pre-populated reasons match the circumstances for the departure, you can also select other circumstances and then provide an additional explanation. So let's just say age of defendant as a reason for the departure here. And then click Save this page. So at this point in time, you've really completed all the sentence information. I always suggest that law clerks and court staff, you click this View Worksheet PDF button in the lower left-hand corner prior to submitting a worksheet, just so you can print it out and review it with the judge prior to submission. That way, if there are any errors, you can make those corrections and still submit the worksheet. Now, one last thing I want to note while looking at this PDF here is that by guidelines rule, each separate criminal event should correspond to their own worksheet. So in this sentencing scenario that we have been working on. It's a multiple criminal event, single sentencing event scenario. So even though I have only 2 offenses in criminal event number 1 and 2 in criminal event number 2, and there's space for 3 on each worksheet, it's still correct that they populate on their own worksheet. So you can see if I scroll here, I see criminal event number 2, and there's still 1 overall guidelines range calculated between them. Sometimes I get questions where people are saying, I'm looking at the PDF and it's missing an entire case number. And 9 times out of 10, or really 100% of the time, it's because you haven't scrolled all the way down to see the additional criminal events. So again, that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, now before I go and ultimately submit the worksheet, I just want to show you how compliance changes when I change 2 different things here. So let me go ahead, I'm going to erase this departure code, and I'm going to click save. All right, so let me jump back to the overall sentence tab, and I'm going to change this to an MSCCSP binding plea agreement. As we discussed and reviewed earlier, any sentence adjudicated via an MSCCSP binding plea agreement, it's automatically going to be deemed compliant. So even though we know this is a below departure for the guidelines, let's see what happens when I go back to the departure and submit tab. So we can see now MAGS is saying there is no longer a departure from the guidelines because it was adjudicated via an MSCCSP binding plea agreement. So if you ever have a question, if you're thinking there should be a departure, you don't know why, MAGS will tell you. In this case, in the red text, I can see that it's not a departure because of the MSCCSP binding plea agreement. Okay, one last thing I want to show you is if I were to utilize a corrections option program, which I can't it's not going to factor into compliance if I have a crime of violence. So let me go back and just quickly delete this first-degree murder. I mentioned earlier, merged nil prost offenses should be removed from the guidelines worksheet. So let's just say this murder first degree ended up being merged or nil prost. So I want to delete it. I would quickly click the trash can icon and confirm I want to delete it, and then click save this page. That's all you have to do to delete a merged or nil prost offense. So let me then jump back to alternatives to incarceration. And now let's actually say that yes, this defendant did participate in drug court. And I'm going to click save this page here. Let me also scroll down. Let's say that yes, also sentenced to some other alternative to incarceration, that being outpatient substance abuse. And they were ordered to complete anger management with 100 hours of community service. Okay. So we can see that now MAGS is flagging this as no longer a departure, 1, because of the MSCCSP binding plea, and 2, because a corrections option program was utilized, and the total sentence, that being the 10 years, is falling within or above the overall guidelines range of 1 year to 10 years, and the case does not involve child sex abuse or escape or a crime of violence. So again, MAGS will usually identify why, if there would otherwise be a departure, why there is not, generally because it was an MSCCSP binding plea or a corrections option program was utilized and the sentence fell within or above the overall guidelines range. Okay, so hopefully walking through those different scenarios, showing you how different selections change guidelines compliance, just kind of ties everything together. I hope that was helpful. Before I just pull up our contact information and we conclude here, are there any questions about MAGS? Anything anyone wants me to show real quick before we hop off? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Okay, so give me 1 second to pull up. Sorry, give me 1 second here. Okay, so you should now be seeing our contact information. So if you ever have any questions, MAGS, guidelines in general, please always feel free to contact us. 301-403-4165 or via email at msccsp@umd.edu. As I mentioned, I'm usually the first point of contact. I recognize a couple of your names, so I know we've spoken at some point. I'm always happy to help with any questions that you may have. So that concludes the presentation. Let me just give everyone one more opportunity to ask any outstanding questions, anything we want to review before we hop off. Sarah, let me check in with you real quick. Do we have anything in the chat?
We do not.
Okay. I'm not seeing anyone raise their hand or anything like that. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all again for taking time out of your day to attend the training. I hope you found it informative and helpful. And with that, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks again for attending.